Our guest today is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Illinois Manufacturers Association. The IMA consists of more than 4,000 member and manufacturing companies. Previously, he served in a number of senior level state government positions under former Governor Jim Thompson, including a term as Secretary of the Illinois Department of Transportation. Our guest today has been at the forefront in efforts to educate the public on the importance of manufacturing to the Illinois economy. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the City Club of Chicago, Greg Baise. Greg?
Jay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity to address this august crowd of all sorts of luminaries and important folks that I look out across the room here and see. Some good friends. First off, I got to tell you, I grew up in a small town in downstate Illinois, Concord, Illinois. It sits west of Jacksonville in that particular area. Jacksonville's important because we have Illinois College graduate, of which I count myself as one, or at least they count me as one. It's Bill Hood and Jim Spizo back over here as well. So the Blue Boys from Illinois College are recognized. Senator Dillard, thank you so much for being here today. I know he's just excited as can be to hear me pontificate, since he gets to hear me do that often on the golf course. I also, as I was saying about the small town I grew up in west central Illinois, it was an interesting place to grow up in the late 60s, and because it was somewhat still very isolated. In fact, the Department of Commerce, U.S. Department of Commerce, came through and did a study of our area, and they recognized us as being socially and economically deprived. We were very proud of that because we'd never been recognized for anything before. But the area was a kind of a farming community, and it was a nice place to grow up in the late 60s, and also was a part of the state that had the ability to matriculate to state government and get involved there, and that's what I was able to do. My background explained enough, and won't need to talk about that, but really what I wanted to talk about today, and the reason I think invited about where is the state's economy, and I think some things that we need to talk about and be concerned with. Since 2000, Illinois has been facing a perfect storm in its industrial base. Economic downturns from natural cycles were worsened by the events of 2001 at the World Trade Center. The ensuing economic downturn seemed to be epicentered here in the state of Illinois. In fact, since 2000, we have lost over 200,000 manufacturing jobs in the state. Now, if you put 200,000 people in one city in this state, that would be the second largest city in Illinois. And those were very good paying jobs, and ones that allowed families to be able to build a very good middle class life. But what I'm concerned about, and what I think all of us, and especially groups like this, should be concerned about, is that rarely do we see stories about Illinois attracting new manufacturing facilities. I see very few stories, including here in Chicago, announcing that something new is coming. However, on the most part, we see that they are leaving for greener pastures, whether it be in Indiana or Iowa, or worse yet, offshore, because they can find cheaper capital, they can find cheaper input costs, both human and other products. But why has so little concern been expressed? Have we become so immune to the job losses that we don't care? How many of you have driven through the old industrial corridors of Cook County and taken a close look? How many business writers or editorial scribes, Paul, have actually walked the streets of Peoria or Moline or Galesburg, those kinds of cities? And what you see there is building after building, telling a story of the industrial base of Illinois that's long gone. Other times we see these sad facts and we just shrug our shoulders, but there doesn't seem to be much concern. In fact, there seems to be none. After being in and around government and politics in Illinois for nearly 30 years, I've seen a lot of changes in our economy and in our politics, some good and some bad. I think it's time that groups like this and people like yourselves start asking some very tough questions of the leaders of both of our parties. And the civic leadership of our communities throughout the state need to understand the Illinois economy is stuck in neutral and not moving forward. The questions I have for our leaders are based on some empirical data gathered from state and federal resources. some from my own observations as I travel around this state, and from anecdotal comments made by my members. In fact, a couple of my board members are here today who are very, very apt to tell me about the problems that they face and the difficulties of expanding or staying in Illinois. The questions I ask are actually very simple on one level, such as, why didn't Illinois land the recent Honda plant? Why did it go to Greensburg, Indiana to create 1,500 jobs? Why did a company like Archer Daniels Midland, that is based, a strong base in the central part of the state, choose Iowa, choose Nebraska for new ethanol plants and not Illinois? Those are just two examples of large Fortune 100 companies that made decisions to go elsewhere. But on my board, as an example, a gentleman by the name of Bert Miller runs a company called Phoenix Closures, small family-owned business that makes bottle caps, has been doing it for nearly 100 years in Naperville. In the last 4 years, he has cited 2 new facilities, one in Iowa, one in Tennessee. Not huge amounts of jobs, about 225, but those jobs lost to the state of Illinois. Another question we'd like to ask, it's been in the news a lot lately, and no one seems to really want to ask this particular part of the question. Why would the legislative body of the state's largest city give itself a salary increase that makes them the highest paid city council in the nation, if not the world, and then fog the action by imposing a wage and benefit requirement on a handful of Mr. Veit's major retailers? They claim they want a living wage, but would rather allow no jobs instead of those that fall short of the requirements that they seek. And then I would like to know why those who have elected them so quietly accept the outcome of the pay raise and the attempt to drive those companies from being here in the city of Chicago. I'd like to know why we have a state government who can't seem to enact cogent policies that create an environment where entrepreneurs want to come, set up shop, thrive, and create jobs. Why do we have a state government whose leadership, and again, Paul, I will say, both sides of the aisle, nothing being personal about your boss, but on both sides of the aisle, watching as our state's pension debt becomes the largest in the nation? Why do those leaders who, without a moment of concern, ignore our state's constitution by passing and implementing an unbalanced budget? And to add insult to injury, the budget is actually prepared by a handful of unnamed aides, agreed upon in good years by 5 leaders. This year it only took 3. And it was a combination of $58 billion, all carved up, packaged by a committee so small you could have held the meeting in a phone booth. Was there any outrage over that? The press dutifully reported it, and again, we just shrugged. Is that why no one questions when government actions contributes to the loss of thousands of jobs? Those that come with good wages and benefits, and those same people then discover that we have uninsured people living here. I want to know why that so many people believe it's good to expand the Medicaid base and not the tax base of the state. Of course, if we really wanted to get a reaction out of government, all we would have to do is suggest to the handful of 6,000 plus units of local government that some of them should be reduced or consolidated. The mere mention of reducing the number of mosquito abatement districts, cemetery boards, township road commissioners, who may oversee only as little as 5 miles of road, would bring the local officials out of the woodwork, crying about the value that they may bring to their locale. Remember that the state of Florida, a state larger in population than Illinois, has fewer local units of government than we have school districts in the state, and yet somehow they squeak by. Of course, the number of school districts we have wouldn't be a concern if we were actually doing a better job of educating our students. Our high school dropout rate is greater than the national average. We seem to be unable to encourage young people to study the disciplines of math, science, and technology, and really prepare them for the jobs that my members have in their facilities. Our state legislature and leaders have increased education funding by $4.5 billion in just the last 3 years alone. But yet, by several measures, our schools have not improved, and too many of our kids are still ill-equipped to be in the world of work. $4.5 billion. And little Johnny still can't read, and if little Johnny happens to be in high school in the largest school district in our state, there's a 1 in 2 chance he won't even show up. But we don't hear about these things nearly enough. And when anyone dares to put a specific proposal to change the situation, it's dissected by those who many times have nothing else to offer, ripped apart by half-truths and slick political advertising or slick ads on TV. And no offense to both of our candidates for governor, but little is being said by either that is either new, provocative, or will change much with our educational system in this state. When I was asked to participate in this public forum series, I thought about all the things that we in the manufacturing sector and those who I represent have been talking about for years with policymakers. All the things from our perspective that would make Illinois a more attractive destination economy for industrialists looking for a home. Much of it's old hat. You've heard it before. We need a predictable tax base, lower structural costs for the workers' compensation and unemployment insurance, easy access to world markets, and well as access to capital. But then I realized that everything that manufacturers or other business people have been looking for that they need to be successful rely on the same people that brought us the policies we have today. Einstein once said that insanity was doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. There's obviously a very serious disconnect between our current policies in this state, both at the state and local level, and the prosperity that is needed to grow the Illinois economy. And in order to improve our hopes for prosperity, we need to ask some of the questions I've just asked today and demand some answers. For example, the Honda plant that I mentioned earlier. Why didn't we get it? We were in competition with Indiana and Ohio. Each state submitted economic incentive packages. Ohio offered $79 million, Indiana $145 million. They added some training assistance. Illinois? Well, we don't know. Our Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity won't say anything other than, quote, and this is a quote from a gentleman from the department, "We are keeping those details close to the vest for the next one." How convenient is that? Why don't we want prospective companies to understand what Illinois has to offer and what it wants to offer? My members all the time bring in various flyers or advertisements from Indiana, Nebraska, Tennessee, Texas. Please come and take a look at our packages that we have. Never yet in almost 14, 15 years in this job has someone brought me a flyer from the state of Illinois. Anytime one of my members loses a customer, an internal review process takes place. They look at pricing, they look at engineering, they look at other processes that they have been about. The loss of customers cannot be sustained. A review of this high-profile effort for the Honda plant would be beneficial for our state and our state's leaders. While the Honda plant and while the Honda plant and others are few and far between, our business leaders need to keep looking for, attempting to lure and urge people to stay in the state of Illinois. So the result of that effort is that Greensburg, Indiana, population 10,260, southeastern Indiana, gets the plant with 1,500 jobs and all of that goes along with it, the increased numbers of suppliers and other associated activities. And it fosters a growing feeling among many around the country that you see noted of how strong the Indiana economy is, and think about that of us saying that, and compared to we in Illinois, Michigan, or Ohio. We could examine any number of other examples, and we could probably use our time here today much better on examining lots of others, but it would take too much time to do that. And this all hasn't occurred in the last 3 or 4 years. It has been a growing problem under both Republican and Democratic administrations. But believe it or not, Illinois is creating jobs. The governor assures us of that every month. But what kind of jobs are we creating in this state? How does Illinois stack up against the rest of the nation? Twice this year so far, Illinois has led the nation in the number of jobs. In April, we had 12,000 additional workers, and in July, 30,000. Well, let's put that into perspective. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, Illinois ranks 48th in job growth during the last 10-year period. Only Ohio and Michigan have been worse. So while it's great that we've had 2 good months, the stark reality is that the Illinois economy has not been performing up to standards for the last decade. And when we look at personal income growth, a real measure of how our state's people are doing in wealth creation, Illinois ranks 49th in growth. Only Nebraska is below us. I can still hardly wait in Springfield for the banners to be made. Soon we'll catch Mississippi. So while we have growth, we don't seem to be able to create the type of employment opportunities that give us sustainable growth. And what kind of jobs have we been creating here? The largest sector of Illinois, or largest growth sector in the Illinois employment picture is in the leisure and hospitality sector. The state's Department of Employment Security says that the average wage in that particular area is $8.72 an hour, or $21,896 a year. Our friends in retail, a windshield review would make one think that this sector has been really hot. However, the retail sector, while stable during the last 3 years, has only increased by 0.6%. An average wage of $11.39, that $11 sort of has a familiar ring to it, but an average annual salary of $30,000. Where have we lost jobs? As I said earlier, manufacturing has lost almost a quarter of its jobs since 2000, and those jobs on average are $15.88 per employee, nearly $48,000 a year with benefits. Information services, the printing sector of this state, has lost 10% of its jobs since the start of the decade. Bottom line is that we are gaining jobs, but maybe they're not the type of jobs that allow our workers to achieve home ownership, the hope of sending their children to college, or being able to retire worry-free. Clearly, this isn't something to feel good about. I'm not diminishing the importance of jobs in various service sectors. They're an important part of our overall economy. But the fact is that our policies are creating a non-competitive atmosphere where better-paying jobs are not encouraged, and that is our state's disgrace. Now, before anybody gets the idea that my presentation will be all doom and gloom, I'm not without recognizing some good things that I think are occurring. First, I think we should commend Mayor Daley in his courage in vetoing the big box ordinance that Dave Veit and others worked very hard in opposition to. His action, I believe, sends a significant message, not only to our state's business leaders, but to others who are looking to the state of Illinois, that the city of Chicago cannot and will not be bullied into unsound public policy. Wage controls have never worked. They, in fact, serve to diminish employment opportunities for many, the very opposite of what proponents of that piece of legislation sought. The Chicago Public Schools would have lost $130 million in property taxes and other revenue, and the city would have lost the economic activity associated with those buildings. Another ray of hope I see is a creation of the Illinois Legislative Manufacturing Caucus that took place last spring. The members of the General Assembly who formed that caucus realized that Illinois is losing manufacturing jobs at an alarming rate, and that not enough of our public leaders and political leaders understand the ramifications. According to the federal government, Illinois is the 7th largest manufacturing economy in the United States. Manufacturing is the single largest portion of the state's GSP, representing 12% in total. And in terms of GSP, manufacturing is nearly 10% larger than the largest next sector in real estate. Finally, I want to touch on an effort that you may find at least a little more intriguing. Nearly 3 years ago, business and labor sat down and talked about unemployment insurance problems that we had in this state. Governor Blagojevich had called that meeting, and we worked together with labor to be able to solve a growing problem with our unemployment insurance trust fund. 2 years later, the governor called together the same business and labor leaders and asked for us to work on workers' compensation. Both of those programs, I think, will bear fruit for improvement of the Illinois economy, but it will take some time to be able to see them fully to their end. It's what's happened afterward that I think has been interesting. In prosperous times, it's easy for our friends in labor to seek a larger share of the pie, and in fact, a traditional relationship that everyone is familiar with. But in troubled times like now, especially with manufacturing, labor and business often find themselves in a wholly different relationship. It's a relationship that recognizes that each needs each other to survive. And so for the last 2 years, members of various labor organizations and members of my board of directors have been on ongoing meetings discovering how much we do have in common. We are realizing that if we are to stem the current trend of job loss, plant closures, lost hopes and dreams of people in our state's manufacturing sector, we must find ways to work together to stop that. We've been willing to ask ourselves some very hard questions and determined to come to some answers. We've been working on adopting a meaningful labor management agenda on manufacturing growth. We have talked about the improvement of workforce development and working with educators to prepare every child for the world of work, to advocate together regulatory reform that promotes good outcome and good investment, harness the state's scientific and engineering talent, which is enormous in this state, to be able to identify new technologies, promote innovations, and allow for markets to grow here in this state. Our goal is to make Illinois the best place for high-performance manufacturing, not just in Illinois or in the nation, but in the world. It's something that I think that when we come to conclusion on, that you and many others will find interesting. Earlier I said I believe that the Illinois economy is stuck in neutral. Why? I think that the layers of Illinois government, the myriad of layers of regulation, the louder bullhorn of the public sector are keeping our state's job creation engine idling, or worse, sputtering. So before I close, here are 4 out-of-the-box suggestions that I have to possibly help get Illinois' economy and political process moving again in the right direction. They won't solve every problem, but I'm sure at least you will agree it will provide for some interesting debates if they were to be implemented or sought to be implemented. First, I believe we ought to return to the 3-member legislative districts for our House of Representatives. Illinois' growing diverse population would be allowed a greater voice, would reduce the concentration of power in leaders of just one party. Our founding fathers wanted representative government in this country to be diverse, or in this case in our state, be as diverse to be able to reflect the character of our community. They expected factions and sects to protect us from what they called the tyranny of the majority. A return to 3-member districts would encourage public discourse and hopefully a need for our legislators to be accountable for what they do in Springfield. 2, limit the legislature to sit for only 60 days, from February 1st to no later than May 1st. They did it this year, they could do it every year. It would allow for legislators to have a full-time career other than becoming a permanent part of the governing class. 3, if those 2 items were to be adopted upon the seating of the General Assembly in January of 2013, legislative pensions would be eliminated, salaries would be reduced by 2/3, therefore part-time and no need for term limits, because if you eliminate the pensions from the equation, it'll be much like Lincoln's Day. Someone else from your area will get a chance to serve. 4th, and maybe the most intriguing, all entities of local government would be, with the exception of counties, cities, and school districts, would be compelled to hold a referendum within their taxing districts, asking the taxpayers if they should continue to exist. Think of the fun we would have for some of our some of our part-time, fully compensated commissions scrambling to justify their existence to a questioning electorate. These changes would spawn debate. They would make more interesting and more accountable our legislators in Springfield. It would allow for our growing diverse population to have an opportunity to have a voice. The reduction of local government would help, I think, ease a growing tax burden that is on the backs of businesses in this state. And finally, in closing, as one old wise hoofer from vaudeville days said, always leave them wanting more. So after those first 4 suggestions are implemented, and with all due deference to Shakespeare, then we'll kill all the lobbyists. Thank you very much.
If you want to ask a question, step up to the microphone. While you're pondering your question, the moderator has a couple.
Okay?
Well, I don't want, I'll just not.
You can come up here.
No, they can hear me. They can hear me.
The camera can't.
Oh, the
Camera
camera
can't.
can't hear me. Given these questions, that may be a good idea. First off, that was a very good speech. How about a round of applause? That's called a setup. And a point of clarification, Einstein used to be an alderman on the Northeast Side, so any of you were wondering who that was. 2 quick questions, and I'll spare you my fact that I fought against cumulative, the ending of cumulative voting in the 1979-80 period, and most of the people who you represent were all for it.
It's true.
we'll just skip over that one after a brief mention. Your 4 points all deal with government, none deal with business. Why?
Well, I think it's my observation that and the complaint that I hear most often from my members is that, as an example, one member wanted to be able to make a change in the warehouse facility in DuPage County. In front of their facility was a retention pond that had been built 20 years earlier as part of when they were on a well and septic system. Now, in order to make that same change, the regulatory process in DuPage County, not even getting to the State Environmental Protection Agency yet, was providing such difficulty of making that kind of change that the individual was thinking about there ought to be an easier way, so I'll look for whether it be Will County or Kendall County or even yet possibly to Iowa. So my point being in that regard, I think that we have become, especially the public sector in the state of Illinois, such a powerful entity that bullhorn, as I said in my comment, is louder on the most time. And if you talked about that particular issue that I just mentioned, how would you make that as a public official, whether Senator Dillard as a representative of the area or Bob Schillestrom as a county board member, saying, well, we're going to violate, quote, and already put forth a regulation on the environmental side, so manufacturer X can, quote, possibly do away with a wetland and hurt the environment here in DuPage County. So I guess that's the focus on that side. I think business classes and business leaders could talk a long time on the changes that are necessary there. And I'll just make a comment. Manufacturers in this state and those who remain here, I talked about the 12% gross state product. That has not significantly decreased in this decade. It has been about the same. Even though 200,000 people less are working in it, the output that the manufacturing sector remains in this state is very strong and very efficient.
All right. Good answer. Question number 2, my second question. No one else, remember, quoting Shakespeare, cowards die many times before their death. The valiant taste death but once. That's, by the way, from Roosevelt, not DePaul. Now, we have Mr. Rosa here, who goes back to the days of Ninian Edwards. So you all know who Ninian.
Second governor of Illinois, right? First one, Shadrach Bond.
We could discuss that some other time. We won't go now. Name me a governor in the last 40 years who was pro-manufacturing jobs. Now, I say that because you say both the candidate and the current governor don't address the issues. Name me a governor who did. Illinois
Well,
governor.
I have to be biased in who I thought was more aggressive on a economic development activity, and that Thompson was that. But I also think Thompson clearly ignored some of the growing underlying problems of the state's competitive nature. I mean, in the 1980s, when we went through the whole downturn in the 79 to 83, essentially, during that whole time period, that became one of his major thrusts of being able, one, to stay in office, I think, and talk so that he showed people that he was being active. But I think he came to have a much greater appreciation. When I say he's a great pro-manufacturing governor, I think Thompson was one who balanced things on both sides. My concern with the current administration, frankly, and I mentioned this to his chief of staff not too long ago, I think this governor could do great wonders if he just changed his rhetoric. The whole business about tax loopholes and seemingly the businesses and corporations aren't doing their fair share. I think it's a bad message that to members of my board and other business people that hear that, just turn off in listening to that. So sometimes the rhetoric that has to change as well in that regard.
Okay. Judith?
My name's Judith Reese. I'm a member of the City Club. This is just a question for information. Are you counting Boeing's manufacturing jobs as Illinois jobs because their corporate headquarters are here, or those are Washington State jobs?
Right. We only count about 250 jobs for Boeing, and that nice sign they have on the building.
Yeah, okay, all right. I don't think so. Thank you.
You don't think so? And
All right. Not exist. Ryan, go ahead.
Ron Gibbs, you mentioned earlier other states are doing things to attract business by brochures or whatever. What would you cite then? What do we need in Illinois if you were to have something out there, 3 things that should be on there to say, come to Illinois, we're the place to do business. What do you need as the underpinnings to do that?
need to stop taxing, I think, in what we're fighting in the competitive nature of the world. And we're not the only state that does it in taxing the input cost for manufacturers, for them to be able to be more competitive. If you want to do just immediate, something that would probably be as best incentive possible to where bottom line to manufacturers is reduce the state's utility tax, 5% from the state, and most local units of government that have the opportunity have imposed it as well. 10% on the charge of energy that's going into the production aspect. The National Manufacturers Association has done a study and has pointed out that in the United States, not Illinois alone, manufacturing starts out with about a 27% disadvantage against anyone else in the rest of the world. A combination of regulatory costs, legal reform costs, healthcare costs, and other local taxes and those kinds of items. So you have a combination of those activities. Here in Illinois, contrast to what you've seen going on in the last 2 years in the state of Indiana, both, again, my comment about the rhetoric that governor talks about, but they've redone their personal property tax system in the state of Indiana. They have reduced actual costs to remain there, and they look for ways to be able to eliminate those structural costs that Indiana manufacturers are facing. And the number of increases there have been actually extraordinary over the last couple of years. So we're not going to see a wholesale change in that because manufacturing was aligned with other businesses right now support a great deal of the public sector activity. And I think that's why, Paul, we have to get back. We've got to attack that root cause. Yes,
Joyce.
Joyce Saxon, member of the Board of City Club.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that bulldozing Mixfield hurt us as far as attracting companies to come to Chicago?
Remember where you are, Mr. Baise.
Well, I was the old IDOT secretary and flew in and out of Meigs Field a gazillion times and things. So again, it's more of a symbol at the time. The problem that Meigs Field had, it didn't have hangars. They needed hangars. So they had corporate jets from the people who utilized those instead of them being at Pewaukee, DuPage, Aurora, and other places. So it didn't really have a local constituency. The constituency for Meigs Field was essentially the folks from Springfield, because it was very convenient in that regard, and also a lot of folks who came in to Chicago to do business. It would have come in from a regional airport standpoint. From my old IDOT days, I think that any time you lost in this state, you lost any concrete to allow for planes to land and avoid congestion in the air was harmful to our state's economy. Now, is it a beautiful place? Does it add to the lure and luster of the Chicago lakefront? Yeah, of course it does. But overall, I don't think it was a great net loss.
Yes, sir.
Mike Levin, I'm a member of the City Club. In your remarks, you mentioned problems with the educational system in the state, which are immense. You just a minute ago talked about healthcare, but then the thrust of your remarks seemed to revolve around government reform and also really tax reform on business. If you had to pick just a priority for business over the next couple of years, what would it be?
I think the state has to get its pension debt problem under control. The viewpoint by business leaders when they look at that particular problem is one that they know that ultimately the piper will have to be paid because they all have their own problems. Old defined benefit plans changing over to defined contribution plans. And by the fact that the state itself is not taking an aggressive attitude in one, trying to fund its current system, but looking for reforms to slow down its cost. The comptroller's report of yesterday, he talked about the fact of I don't know if he said it yesterday, but I've seen him reported 67% of all state revenues are going to be going to pension and also Medicaid funding. So it's going to be pushing that particular problem all across the scale, whether it be education funding or some other items. So I think if I had a choice, the state government would do that first.
Jill.
Jill Wine-Banks.
Sure.
And my question stems from your statement that the schools aren't preparing students for the jobs your members have. I am the chief officer for education to careers for the Chicago Public Schools. We train students for jobs in manufacturing as well as in every other career path. And my question is whether I can count on you to help us get work-based learning opportunities for our students with your members, because that would be one of the best ways to improve the educational outcomes for the students to help them be prepared for the real jobs that you have.
Well, the answer to the first question is yes, and we have the association and various activities with various groups have attempted to do that. But I must say, a common complaint of many of our members, and there's the adage that there are more classrooms in American businesses today, and especially manufacturing facilities, than there are actually in schools because of the training that's necessary. And not so much that that's a general indictment of the educational system everywhere, but because of the changing nature of the manufacturing world in particular, or even in other service sectors, that the ability for the traditional K through 12 folks to be able to respond to that has not been there. And so obviously, Fry, the kinds of things that you're doing are absolutely necessary. To the point of being work-based relationships has become a more difficult situation because of the safety concerns and all of those kinds of things the manufacturers have to be wary of as people walk into their facilities. I've heard time and again where members of mine have gone to local schools, want to do some kind of program, only to be rebuked by their insurance or other folks to say, you got to be careful in that. So how do you make that balance? So, and
together we could solve that. Those are easy to solve problems. I come from industry. I'm not an educator. I was brought in to help bring about these kinds of relationships, and I think you'll find a much more creative atmosphere at the Office of Education to Careers than in general. So
well, I've got a
a
board member back there that's at a table, Ed Hadeen, who has been very active in that area and has done a lot of different work in trying to promote relationships. Ed, you may want to talk with Jill afterwards and things. They're at the back table.
Thank
Great.
you.
Oh, yes.
There he comes.
A Ripon College graduate.
Isn't it? Yeah, but is he?
Tom Hardy, City Club member.
Sure it's not Chief?
That's not. No. Greg, do you think we need a constitutional convention? What kind of Pandora's box does that open, and how do you make that happen?
Come on, Greg.
Well, actually, my viewpoint is that when you open up the discussion, the dialogue of something like that, it can only be beneficial. And trying to push the business community to be more active in the process. You've had a great example of what it takes for a sector of the economy to come together and get concerned about an issue in Dave Veit and Jerry Roper's discussions and efforts that they've fought on the big box issue. Several years ago, obviously having the mayor's support was an enormous leg up in getting it done, but it wasn't a slam dunk that was going to be the case in getting it. It took a lot of local businesses and a lot of folks to say, this is nuts, we've got to stop this. Much of what we see and what happens to business in general in Springfield is done fairly silently. It's not with that kind of controversy. And so it's needed for, whether you be a manufacturer, a retailer, what kind of business, to be more locally involved. Representative Turner over there hears from business people, and it has responded to that as he talks to us in Springfield about various things. Senator Dillard hears from his local businesses, probably heard about from the gentleman that I referenced on the pond in DuPage County. You've got to have more of that kind of activity. So to a constitutional convention, in fact, I'll ask you, who's the only member of the General Assembly that's still serving that was a member of the CONCON? Okay, so I'm just going to tell you to shut up. Not gonna do it. But having that kind of, think of the leadership that came from this state, for this state, that came out of that effort of the 1970s. Literally was the generation of folks who've been running things for the last 25 years. Now, you can argue whether success or not of that. I happen to think that the decrease of the General Assembly in 1982, and I'll take that, Paul, I was trying to remember, I wasn't with the manufacturers at that time, if they were all against it. There was seemingly this great outcry because, quote, they were costing too much money and they'd given themselves a little bit of a pay raise. In fact, poor old Jim Edgar was starving to death at the time when he wanted that pay raise to be able to do that.
The current lieutenant governor was leading the charge. Yeah. Not only would there be less bills introduced, right, Kirk? Certainly the bills have diminished. There would be more competition. Look at DuPage County. It's so competitive out there right now, it's unbelievable. That's why Dilworth's hair is turning gray. It was one of the greatest scams ever pulled upon the people of Illinois, and now you guys have finally realized what it cost you. Well, you weren't there then, but it's a disaster for this state.
It is a disaster for the state and the Constitutional Convention to redo some of the things. Would it open up, the change of political discourse, public discourse, dramatically different today than it was in 1970, and I'm not aware of any constitutional effort in any state going on right now, and at all anywhere in the country. Are you, Paul?
Well, they have to, by law, well, you're speaking.
Well, go ahead.
By law, every 20 years, you have to have a thing about, that was part of the con thing. 20 years, you got to decide if you want another one. God forbid we ever do it, because 1970 in Illinois was the equivalent of the founding fathers for this nation. We had some of the brightest people ever in government at that con convention. I just wonder, really wonder, what kind of people would be replacing them this time with the special interest and all the other kind of stuff. I mean, it might be con, and it may be lob for lobbyists. I mean, it would just be a very dangerous thing. But cumulative voting is, I think, is almost impossible to bring back. It's a legal thing. But yeah, I mean, I'm against it. I'm against con coming back because I don't think we could ever match up those people we had then. It was a special time. There were, you had Dawn Clark Netsch debating financing, and you had people. Who? Wayne Whalen. Our own Wayne Whalen, before he became kind of wealthy, debating these kinds of great issues. You had really smart people. I have a copy of those debates. They were really first-rate debates. I've stolen from those for years. And those ideas are still good. Unfortunately, the people who follow them, we don't have a lot of potential con members are running around. Back to Greg. Any more questions?
Like that's it. Folks, thank you very much. It's enjoyable.
Wait. Give him a big round of applause.
Okay.
Watch this tap dance. A official City Club mug, and if you look closely, disregard that word China. This was made in Beardstown.
This was made here.
Beardstown, Illinois, absolutely. A book published in Jacksonville, and as you well know, Jacksonville is the home of, besides the college, first newspaper, right?
That's right. Continuously published.
You thought I spent all my years in state government just doing nothing. And a one-year membership to the City Club of Chicago, and after that year, Greg, pay up.
Have I already paid my 50 this year?
Has he paid? 50?
You got away with less than that?
No. Big round of applause for Greg Berry. Adjourned.